In the next few minutes, I want to walk you through the anatomy of a solicitation call, okay? The first point, as part of my introduction here, is to remember that this is a friend. We're talking to a friend. When you talk to a friend, it's not a monologue, it's a conversation. And the number one mistake that I see made by a lot of people when they're first starting out doing major gift solicitation calls and visits is that they sit down, they have a little bit of small talk, and then they immediately launch into a presentation and then put a number on the table and then just keep talking. I mean, they just talk too much, right? So the 3 points that I want to cover in this short little video is number 1, be a good listener. Number 2, get good at asking questions. And number 3, ask for the gift, and I'll tell you how to ask for the gift. My first tip is to be a good listener. Again, this is a conversation, not a monologue. You know, there was a study done many years ago, I believe by Xerox, and they wanted to find out what separated their best salesman from everybody else. And what they discovered was that the best salesman spoke about 20% of the time in the solicitation call, right? And listened 80% of the time. And I have found that to be so true in my work. If I listen 80% of the time and I talk only 20% of the time, I close more gifts and I close better gifts, right? Now, why would that be? It's because I think when we actively listen, it validates a person, right? They feel part of the process, right? They feel like you're talking to them, again, like a friend, not like somebody that you're trying to sell something to. So again, listen 80% of the time and talk 20% of the time. Now, if you're going to be a good listener, you also have to get good at asking smart questions, right? And one of the things that I like to do when I visit with people is, presuming that they know something about the project, because we've had conversations, over a course of perhaps months or maybe even years, leading up to this point where we're going to, talk turkey about a gift, right? I will begin with open-ended questions, and as I go through the visitation, my questions become more and more specific. So become an artful questioner. For example, when I first sit down and we make a little small talk, I might comment about, pictures hanging on the wall in their office or in their home, talk about family and all of that. And then we'll transition to the topic at hand, and I'll say something about, as you know, Jim, we're here today to talk about a possible gift to XYZ Capital Campaign. What are your thoughts on the project? I mean, that's an open-ended question. What are your thoughts on the project? And you don't know where that's going to go. They may have concerns, they may be excited, they may be nonchalant about it, but by opening the conversation with that very simple question, what are your thoughts on the project? You will know what direction the conversation needs to go. And what I'm trying to do by asking a very simple open-ended question is, throughout the process of the solicitation call, the attitude I bring to that is, I want to give people permission to be honest with me. Let me say that again. I want to give people permission to be honest with me. Here's what happens. If I go out with a priest or a sister to ask somebody for a gift, what I have found amongst Catholics is they are reluctant to tell father or sister what they really think, what their real concerns are. They will be polite, they will nod a lot, and they will make a gift based upon whatever thoughts and feelings and attitudes resides deep in their heart. If some of that stuff that is deep in their heart is not expressed to me, I cannot address it. And quite often, there are misunderstandings, perhaps, that they're reluctant to share because they don't want to be impolite to father or sister, right? They don't want to share anything that's going to ruffle feathers or anything like that. So again, the point here is, throughout the conversation, I want to telegraph to them that it's okay to be honest. Tell me what you really think. That is just so critical to having a good, productive conversation about the gift. If you don't do that and you leave and you don't know really what's on the heart and mind of the person, whether that be some misunderstanding or some misgiving, you will never maximize giving in that particular circumstance. So I ask, what are your thoughts on the project? That's how we open it up. Or if it's a person that hasn't been very involved up to this point, I might open the conversation by saying, have you heard much about the project? Have you heard much about the project we're trying to fund? And then as we go along, I may, in my questions, go from the very, very general questions to more and more specific questions, as I mentioned a moment ago. And so I might ask whether there's a particular aspect of the plan that excites them. Now, after that conversation, we come to the third section, or the third aspect of the solicitation call, and that is simply asking for the gift. And when it comes to asking for the gift, there's actually three things that you're trying to discern in your conversation when you're asking for the gift. The first one is simply, does this sound like a project you'd be willing to support? That's a yes or no answer, right? Does this sound like something you'd be interested in supporting? The second aspect of the ask is, if so, how much? And the third aspect is the payment plan. So again, A, B, and C, 3A, B, and C. Ask for the gift has three sections. Does this sound like something you'd be willing to support? That's a yes or no binary question. Number two, if so, how much? And number three, the payment plan. Now, don't confuse the total gift with the payment plan. Let me explain that. Especially when you're asking for really big gifts, 6-figure, 7-figure gifts, you have to make it clear that the total gift and how that gift is paid over a period of time are two separate issues. Because as I mentioned in an earlier video, when you're asking for 6 or 7-figure gifts, it's not uncommon to find that people are already committed to another charity for significant dollars, right? And so they may not have anything to give you this year. Maybe their budget opens up next year. Fine, we have a 5-year pledge period in the campaign. You can structure the gift however suits your circumstances, right? And so if we need $1 million to complete the capital campaign, if that's the slot we're trying to fill on the giving pyramid, you don't necessarily have to make $1 million gift, this year or this month or this year. You can structure that gift. As long as that gift is structured within our campaign timelines, we're going to be okay. So make sure that you separate the amount of the gift with the payment plan and how that gift is actually comes to fruition. One more piece of advice, and this is really critical. Before you leave the conversation about money, it's important to know whether or not the number that you put on the table is a number that is truly under consideration by the person. Sometimes I've seen situations where a president or a priest will put a number on the table like $1 million, and the person will say absolutely nothing one way or the other. And we'll leave and we'll have $1 million ask on the table, but we have no idea whether or not that was an ask that would be truly considered by the person, right? And so as part of the conversation, before you leave the delicate topic of money and get back to small talk, which is much more comfortable, I think you have to have some conversation with the person to say, to try and discern whether or not the number you put on the table is indeed realistic, right? Because if you don't, and you leave thinking, yeah, we got $1 million ask on the table, what happens sometimes is, from the donor's perspective, you walk out the door and they're left wondering, how in the world do they expect me to do $1 million gift, right? And so then you call them back, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and all of a sudden this person that you thought was a friend, it seems like they're avoiding your calls. Now, why would that be? Because the number you put on the table was not a true number that they're truly considering. And they don't want to break the bad news to you, right? They don't want to break the bad news to you. So you sit there in limbo, and that person is on the pending list of proposed gifts, but it's almost impossible to close. And so my advice to you is, before you leave that visitation, make sure that you have some heart-to-heart conversation as to whether or not the number you put on the table is indeed a realistic number for them to consider. Let's summarize. Number 1, be a good listener. Remember, this is a conversation, not a monologue. Number 2, ask questions. Begin with broad, open-ended, generic questions, general questions, and then move toward the specific. Number 3, ask for the gift. And there's 3 parts to asking for the gift. Number 1, you're trying to discern whether or not this is something they would be willing to support. Number 2, you're trying to discern the total gift amount, the total commitment that they would be willing to make to the campaign. And number 3, then you're trying to discern the payment plan. So watch this video a couple times, get that in your bones, and go ask.